Hey folks, welcome to this crazy chapter. Chapter 6 always seems a little bit random to me. These three things have some things in common with each other, but this really is one of those chapters where they kind of have like, we have public opinion laying around, what do we do with it? We have political socialization, we have the media laying around, what do we do with these things? Well, we'll just all throw them in a big potpourri in the chapter 6. Nobody will care that we're grouping them all together. That's one of the strange things about chapter 6 is it's a chapter over three separate things. Really, one of these things, the media, in my opinion, deserves its own chapter, but that's not how they do business here in this particular textbook. So what we are doing today is we are getting into all three of these subjects. We will walk through each of them one at a time. We'll talk about how they relate to each other a little bit, and for the most part, it's going to be a pretty straightforward chapter, particularly when we get to the media, though. That's kind of the meat of this chapter. But it is important that we understand the other two things as well. Let's go in order, shall we? Let's start at the top. Let's do it. The first thing chapter 6 is about is public opinion. Well, fine. What is public opinion, though? Textbook defines it as the aggregate of individual attitudes or beliefs shared by some portion of the population. I don't like that definition. That is a mouthful for describing something as simple as public opinion. Public opinion really is just how the population that you live in feels about things. How does the population feel about universal child care? How does the population feel about climate change? How does the population feel about, the Office reruns? Just however they poll, that's how the public feels about stuff. Okay, that's all it is. We don't need to get fancy pants with the stuff about aggregates of attitudes and some portions of the blah, blah, blah. Let's just talk about how the population feels about stuff, all right? Now, generally speaking, when it comes to how the population feels about things, sometimes everybody agrees on something. That is not common. I don't know if you know people, but we tend to be pretty opinionated. We tend to have very different opinions about different things. And as a result, it's not common that we all agree on something, but we do sometimes. And when we do, that's called a consensus. That's when there's general agreement among whatever population we're talking about. Now, rarely, I don't think you will ever get 100% agreement on anything, but here's an example of what the consensus looks like. When we talk about expanding background checks to make universal background checks for all gun purchases in America, that stuff polls outstandingly. Over 90% of Americans want universal background checks for gun purchases. That's consensus. It's not 100%. It's not 100%, but you're just never going to get 100%. You just simply never are. Now, most of the time when we talk about politics and opinions, we are not talking about things that we all agree on because those conversations are kind of lame. I don't know if you have many political conversations with people with the same opinions as you, but you may sit around and be like, man, did you hear about that thing that I don't like? And the other person will be like, yeah, I heard about it. I don't like it either. All right, what do you want to order for lunch? Most of the time when we talk in politics, we are talking about the areas where we disagree. And the areas where we disagree is called divided opinion. Now that's, again, as you would suspect from the name, it's anytime public opinion is polarized between different positions. Have you heard that word before? Polarized? Polarized simply means, well, think of the polar ice caps, right? When it comes to the Earth, no... Can I draw an Earth for you? Here's your Earth with all the continents on it, okay? So when it comes to the Earth, here are your polar ice caps. There's no points on Earth that are farther from each other than the polar ice caps. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about polarization. Polarization largely means that we are very, very apart from each other, and that's what divided opinion is trying to get to. For instance, here's what divided opinion may look like in person, okay? Generally, this is a poll that was conducted back in 2018. How do Republicans really, once again, this is the, right here, you'll see what this poll is measuring. Do Republican voters think a particular issue is a very big problem? And do Democratic voters think it's a very big problem? Look at the very first issue right here, the way racial and ethnic minorities are treated by the criminal justice system. Republicans, by and large, don't think that's a very big problem in America, but Democrats, by a 70% clip, obviously do. So anyways, as you look through this particular slide, you'll see lots of different areas where Democrats and Republicans have very different opinions. When it comes to climate change, Republicans and Democrats have very different levels of concern. Income inequality, racism. Over here, do you see my hand over here? Over here, you see illegal immigration. Democrats don't think it's a very big deal. Republicans think it's a very big deal. There are other areas where their levels of concern are roughly the same. You'll see that with like the budget deficit, drug addiction, violent crime. So there are areas where like Democrats and Republicans largely agree on the seriousness of an issue, but you see polarization throughout on many of these issues where Republicans and Democrats believe certain issues have very different degrees of seriousness. Now, generally speaking, let me actually, before I show you this, let me ask you a question. Do you, as you're looking at this slide, do you consider yourself more Democratic, more Republican? Which way do you consider yourself? Maybe you don't consider yourself either, but I know some of you consider yourself more Democratic and more Republican. So let me ask you something. How do we know that Democrats or Republicans feel this way? Did they poll you? They certainly didn't call you. Now, did they? Did they? I don't think they did, right? Instead, what we're doing is we're trying to measure how Democrats and Republicans feel about these listed issues. And what's the best way to measure that? Clearly, they're not contacting every Republican and every Democrat in America. But yes, polls is the best way to figure out how people feel about things, okay? You poll the population. You contact somebody. This particular poll, we might have said, do you consider yourself supporting Democrats or Republicans? The average responder will say one of those two, and we'll say, okay, how seriously do you take job opportunities for all Americans? They weigh in, and then over time, we kind of average out their answers, or we total up their answers. That's how those polls generally work. But guys, once again, do you consider yourself, let me ask you here, do you consider yourself Democratic or Republican? If you do, were you contacted for this poll? I'm willing to bet you weren't. Matter of fact, we have a country of 300 million people. 300 million people. How does any one poll measure that? Obviously, they're not reaching out to all 300 million people, asking them if you're Democratic or Republican. I mean, your average poll is going to have 1,000 respondents. If you have 1,000 respondents, that's a really good poll. So how is 1,000 people supposed to represent how 300 million people feel? Well, polls are actually fairly reliable when it comes to that because they try their best to follow the principle of randomness. The most important principle in polling is randomness. There's a lot of P's in there, but let me say it one more time. The most important principle in polling is randomness. That's the most important principle in polling. Randomness best allows you to take a small group, sample it effectively, and have it represent the larger group that they're in. So we here at OTC have a student body that's anywhere from like 10,000 to 12,000 students. We want to make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck, that you feel like OTC is helping you in your education. That's how we feel. That's what we want to happen. So if I reach out to all of my A students and I say, how's OTC treating you? Is the collection of the attitudes of A students going to represent the student body as a whole? Probably not. It's going to give you a sliver, but it's not going to represent the entire OTC experience. So tell you what, I'm just going to reach out to students who aren't passing classes. If we just contact those students, are they going to give you an accurate reflection of what OTC is offering the student body? Probably not. They'll give you an important sliver, but they're not going to give you the whole picture. No, what you want to do is you want to contact OTC students at random. So long as you do that, you're going to get a certain percentage of males, certain percentage of females. Law of averages, you'll probably get 50-50 on that. You'll probably get, here at OTC, probably get 90% white students, 10% students of color. If you reach out randomly, you'll get a certain percent of A students, B students, C students, and so on, okay? So at the end of the day, by doing it randomly, that really gives you the best shot at an honest sampling of what OTC looks like, a representative sampling of what OTC looks like. That being said, polling is hard. Polling is really hard to do. There are several challenges for polling that we have to keep in mind at all times. Because while polls, especially these national opinion polls, which are extremely professionally done, they are pretty reliable, but they are not infallible. And that's because polling is hard to do, despite their best efforts. Polling is hard to do. One major issue with polling is that you are randomly selecting people, but sometimes that randomness works against you. What if you randomly reach out to people, but you end up with 75% women respondents and 25% male respondents? Can you hear that in the background? There's an earthquake drill going on while I'm... All right, I don't know if you can hear that, but we're going to keep on plowing. Let's keep on plowing, okay? There's an earthquake drill going on while I'm talking to you, so we will just pretend that I'm... That's not ideal timing. All right, so I'm just going to keep on talking. Hopefully you're not hearing the stuff in the background. But anyways, if we randomly select people, this is bizarre, if we randomly select people, we may end up with far more women than men. And that's not what America looks like. America looks pretty close to 50-50 male and female. I don't know what the actual percentage is. I think it's like 51-49 or something like that. But regardless, what do you do then? Do you ditch the poll altogether? I mean, a lot of resources goes into these polls. Ditching the poll might not financially make sense for you. Do you run with the poll as it is, even though it doesn't represent what America looks like? Do you somehow weight the men to make it closer to 50-50? If so, how do you weight them? Yeah, it's not clear how you would do that. So this is a really, really tough choice to make, and that's one of the reasons why polling is difficult. Another reason is because fairly phrasing poll questions is difficult. You want to fairly phrase your poll questions. It's not always the easiest thing to do. Not always the easiest thing to do. For instance, in some circumstances, if you are responding to a poll, you want to really make sure you watch out for leading questions and push polls, which largely mean the same thing. But leading questions is where I'm actually trying to lead you to a conclusion. I'm not really giving you a neutral question. I'm giving you a question that I hope pushes you towards a particular answer. That's why we call it a leading question or a push poll. For instance, if I asked you the question, do you feel that climate change is really occurring? Okay, if I asked you that question, I think that's fairly phrased. The answer you give me will, I think, be a direct reflection of how you feel. Now, on top of that, what if I ask the question this way? Do you agree with the overwhelming majority of scientists that believe that climate change is absolutely occurring, or do you disagree with their findings? What have I just done in asking that question? I've asked the same question now, haven't I? But I've phrased it in a way that have definitely led you to a particular conclusion. So you want to make sure about that. And that's fine. That's a clownish example. But there are some issues that are really difficult to fairly phrase. How do you fairly phrase a question about immigration? Now you're talking about people who are coming to the border illegally. Do you call them illegal aliens? That has a little, you're calling a people an alien. That seems to be pretty pejorative and might lead you to say, oh, crack down on the aliens. But what if I call them undocumented immigrants? All of a sudden they sound like it's a humanitarian concern. Let's take a certain approach on that. The language that you use, sometimes there isn't neutral language available to you. There isn't neutral language available to you. So sometimes fairly phrasing poll questions is difficult to do. Now, on top of that, so polling can get very complicated. Lots of these excellent polling outfits have lots of difficult decisions to make. And as they make these difficult decisions, they may end up creating, without any blame, that's just incidentally, they've done this, they may end up creating a house effect, meaning that their results differ consistently in perhaps slight ways from other polling outfits. That's not to say that they're biased. That's not to say that their polling isn't valuable or accurate. It's just to say that they may have consistently different results based on the choices that they make in their polling. CNN's has historically been more Republican or conservative leaning compared to all other polls. Does that mean that CNN is in the tank for the Republican Party? Obviously not. I don't know how much CNN you watch, but they're obviously not in the tank for the Republican Party. It's just that the choices that they make lead to lean Republican, lean conservative results in a lot of their polls. Generally speaking, that's why people like myself rely less and less on individual polls, and we rely more and more on, you don't need to know this part at the bottom here, but I rely more and more on polling aggregation firms like 538.com. 538.com maybe leans a bit to the left, maybe, but it's absolutely invaluable in averaging polls together and grading them based on their reliability. So I have really used polling aggregation sites like Real Clear Politics or 538.com. All right, that is our first portion of this chapter, talking about public opinion. Let's keep on trucking. This time, I hope, with fewer earthquake tests. But anyways, let's talk about the second portion of Chapter 6, and that's political socialization. Now, in Unit 1, we talked about political ideology. Don't confuse political ideology with political socialization, okay? Political ideology, as we talked about it earlier this semester, that's any time. Well, the political ideology is your political belief system. That's your political ideology, your political philosophy. What are you? Are you more conservative? That's your political ideology. Are you more liberal? That's your political ideology. That's not what political socialization is. People do confuse them quite a bit. Political socialization is the process by which you get your political beliefs. The process by which you get your political beliefs. Okay? So let me give you a metaphor, all right? Your political beliefs are Oz, from The Wizard of Oz. It is the place you have arrived at. How you get there is political socialization. It is the yellow brick road, the process by which you get to your ideology, okay? I hope that's useful. Now, obviously, as you live your life, there are a million different things that try to influence your politics. Obviously, polls show over and over again the most impactful influence on your political beliefs is who? Do you know? If you had to guess, what do you think? Well, the answer are your parents. So if this poll was conducted earlier in 2021, since that's when this lecture is taking place. The poll question is, thinking about social and political issues, how do your views compare to that of your parents? And you'll notice that the gray boxes are huge. People are generally about the same, maybe a little bit more liberal than their parents, but for the most part about the same. And that's not necessarily because, well, let's get into that, shall we? Let's talk about some of the key socialization influences. We just talked about your parents, so let's start there. Parents are absolutely communicating their politics to you all the time. At least most of them are. Maybe in very overt ways, like you can't trust Joe Biden, or maybe in more subtle ways, like sharing their philosophies about life. And you as a child are receptive to your parents. Now, your parents aren't trying to brainwash you. Some of them, I'm sure, are. But your parents aren't trying to brainwash you for the most part. They're just sharing their life lessons with you. And you as a kid have grown up learning to trust them. Those of you that still have relationships with your parents, you just grow up learning to trust them. Your mom says, don't touch that or you'll get hurt. You touch it, you'll get hurt. Your dad says, don't do that or you'll be a jerk. So you do that. Turns out you're a jerk when you do it. So you just grow up implicitly trusting them. And so when they tell you this is the way the world is, you're naturally gravitating towards that. Also, in addition to that, which of your parents are you exactly like? If you asked me, I am my mom, basically. You may never cross paths with my mom, but imagine my mom as a person who is exactly like me, 30 years older, without a beard. It is my mom. I am essentially my mom. I look like my mom. I talk like my mom. And to be honest with you, I think like my mom. So it's natural that her and I will kind of view the world the same way. You tend to resemble one of your parents. You adopt their views over the course of your life. There's nothing sinister about that necessarily. You just like your parents, and as a result, you'll oftentimes adopt their political views. Of course, they are not the only influence on your politics. Your education, I'm sorry, before I get to your education, I wanted to ask you this question here real quick. If you had to guess, how much influence do you have on your parents' political views? Now, maybe some of you actually do have views on your parents' political views, and if that's the case, great, way to go. But research says, for the most part, you don't. Kids don't have much of an influence on their parents' political views. Really, all you can do is present them with evidence and say, isn't this interesting? And your parents might go, huh. And that's about all the research says you can reliably do with your parents. Now, there's maybe some of you out there that have a lot of sway with your parents. If so, awesome. Anyway, so family is a key socialization influence. Another key socialization influence is your education. That's right, your education. What you're doing right now, the guy you're talking to right now, this guy is influencing you politically. It is happening. I am making you my minion. Of course, actually, that's not what education does to you. We have research that says that greater education doesn't necessarily make you more Democratic or Republican. So that doesn't really make you more conservative or liberal. Okay, even though I'm influencing you right now, I'm not really making you, according to research, I'm not really making you more conservative or liberal. Matter of fact, the studies suggest that the more education you get, the more moderate you become. That's interesting. But that's not what, obviously, a ton of research says. Instead, research says that the more education you get, and that's not even about government and politics, just more education in life, but especially in government and politics, the more education you get, the more likely you are to become an active political participant in society. You're more likely to donate to candidates, you're more likely to vote, you're more likely to volunteer, you're more likely to run for office yourself. Okay, that's not necessarily to say that you will do these things. I'm just saying you are more likely to do these things because of the education you're getting. You're welcome as I influence you right now. Now, on top of that, you are also subject to peer pressure, and that's not necessarily your peers trying to do this, vote this way. It's not necessarily that, although it can be. But for the most part, the demographics that you belong to will kind of guide you in how you vote. And once again, this kind of cuts to what we were talking about with family. You have a lot in common with your parents. You are likely to vote like them or have similar beliefs to them. You have a lot in common with your peers. That's why they are your peers. And as a result, you're more likely to be swayed by them. You're more likely to adopt their views. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about your peers. Let's talk about different demographics, shall we? I like influencing you, if that's what I'm doing. Let's talk about different demographics. Matter of fact, let's create a little chart over here, shall we? Are you going to vote more, what's on the left? Are you going to vote more Democratic, or are you going to vote more Republican? Can you see that? Yes, you can. Okay. The Democratic Party is called the DNP, the Democratic National Party, and the Republican Party, this is weird, it's called the GOP. So if you ever see that on the news and you're like, a GOP senator, blah, 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 and you're like, GOP? Who's GOP? Well, that stands for the Republican Party. The Republican Party's original name was the Grand Ole Party. And that's not Grand Ole Party, that's Grand Ole Party. No D, Grand Ole Party. Is what the Republicans' official name is. And that's why when we talk about Republicans, we'll often abbreviate it as GOP. Anyways, let's walk through some of these demographics, shall we? First of all, what about educational achievement? If you are more educated, are you more likely to vote Democratic or are you more likely to vote Republican? To be honest with you, there is some polling trends in that these days that suggest the more education you get, the more this way or that way you'll vote. But those trends are so new that I'm uncomfortable talking about them. So right now, let's stand with what we've known over the last several decades, and that's the fact that the results are mixed. If you get more education, you're more likely to vote, but you're not more likely necessarily to vote Democratic or Republican. Now, I will just mention, as an aside, there have been trends emerging over the last couple years. We don't need to get into that because, like I said, those trends are too new and I don't feel comfortable talking about them just yet. Let's talk about long-standing trends. First long-standing trend is that educational achievement does not create a strong bias towards Democrats or Republicans. Another long-standing trend, though, is economic status. How wealthy are you? And generally speaking, this is a pretty reliable scale. The scale is, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote Democratic. I'm sorry, I said that the wrong way. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. The less wealthy you are more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. Now, that's not to say, so generally saying, what economists typically do is they break the economy up into quintiles. Quintiles is just a fancy way of saying fifths. And so the wealthiest fifth in America typically tends to vote the most aggressively Republican. The poorest fifth in America tends to aggressively vote Democratic. And then as you walk through these fifths, wealthier and wealthier, they tend to get more Republican, more and more Republican. Another pretty strong trend is your religious commitment. Your religious commitment. Keep in mind, when I say religious commitment, I'm not saying are you religious or not. I'm saying how often do you practice your religion in going to church? How often do you go to church? Or if you're not Christian, you're like another religion, how often you go to a mosque, how often you go to temple, how often do you go to a religious service? And the trend that we have shows that the more frequently you go to church, the more likely you are to vote Republican. The more church you go to, the more likely it is that you will vote Republican. The less church that you go to, the more likely it is that you are going to vote Democratic. Now, again, these are just trends. I'm not saying if you're sitting there and you're like, well, I'm a poor atheist, I guess I'm a Democrat. That's not what I'm trying to tell you here. I'm just saying that these are the trends. Do you go to church multiple times a week? That's what I do. I go to church 2 times a week, me personally. If that's the case, you are very likely to vote Republican. That's not necessarily, just very likely to. Do you tend to go once a week? Do you tend to go just a few times a year? Are you not religious at all, or you don't go to church at all? Well, then you're very likely to be Democratic. Keep in mind, again, these are just trends, though. Now, on top of that, what about race and ethnicity? We have a pretty reliable, matter of fact, there's actually been a cleaving here recently. It used to be like 60-40 vote one way, 60-40 vote the other, but we've actually seen a cleaving where it's actually getting more divided. White people are increasingly likely to vote Republican. White people are increasingly likely to vote Republican, and people of color, or what I will just call non-white, tend to vote increasingly Democratic. That's been a division that's been happening for the last decade or so. We've started to see a division there over the last decade and a half as these two categories of Americans are voting more and more aggressively. Now, I don't want to create the impression that all minorities tend to vote Democratic. That's not always the case. You don't need to know this right here, but there are some minorities, such as Cubans, such as the Vietnamese, that do tend to vote more Republican. But by and large, minority populations tend to vote very aggressively Democratic. In particular, the black population is like 90% Democratic. But race and ethnicity is actually created a bit increasingly divided in America, but it's not as crazy as urban versus rural. You know the difference between urban versus rural before I'm even about to show you here. But oddly enough, urban voters, people who live in big cities, tend to be more Democratic. Rural voters tend to be more Republican. Matter of fact, this is a straight up sliding scale. The more urban your neighborhood is, the more likely it is to vote Democratic. The more rural your neighborhood is, the more likely it is to vote Republican. I'm going to be honest with you, I have no idea why this is the case. I don't know why this is the case. There was a study I read like a decade ago, and it said the closer you live to your neighbors, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. And the farther you are from your neighbors, the more likely it is that you're going to be a Republican. Why is that? Why would the distance to your neighbors influence your political beliefs? I'm going to be honest with you, I have no idea. And every time I read a story giving suggestions as to why that's the case, it rings false to me. Every time it rings false. Like I was reading a story that was like, if you live in an urban neighborhood, you're more likely to know your neighbors and help out your neighbors. I'm like, have you grown up in a small town? Small town, everybody knows everybody in a small town. Everybody helps everybody in a small town. People are like, well, if you're out in a rural area, you're more likely to have to fend for yourself. So you're more likely to be conservative. Have you heard? Have you lived in a big city? In big cities, people have to fend for themselves all the time. So none of those explanations make a ton of sense to me. Perhaps you have an explanation. I'd love to hear it. Feel free to start a discussion this week and ask that question, because to be honest with you, I have no idea why this is the case. We also need to talk about, here, by the way, this is what I'm trying to illustrate to you. Do you see this chart here? See that red line? That red line is showing the increasing gap of difference between rural voters and urban voters. The difference as recently as 2006 wasn't that great. Urban voters and rural voters were only about 21 points apart, Democrat versus Republican. But nowadays, they are 50 points apart. 50 points apart. Rural voters and urban voters are completely different now. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure why that is. Although you do see at the very top how race, in the blue line, how race has always been a deep division between how people vote. Anyways, let's talk about gender, shall we? Because gender leads to very different voting behaviors as well. Let's go back to 2016. I know we've had a presidential election since then, but let's go back to 2016. If we say only women are allowed to vote for president in the Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump election of 2016, and we discount every vote conducted by a male, look what happens. Hillary Clinton wins and destroys Trump in a landslide. So women tend to vote more Democratic. You only have like 8 or so states, I don't know the actual number, 10 or so states where women vote more Republican than Democratic. And it's those states right there. You don't need to worry about Nebraska. We'll talk about Nebraska in Chapter 8. Nebraska is weird. Anyways, on top of that, let's rescind the 19th Amendment for a moment now, shall we? No, don't allow women to vote anymore. We only count men's votes in 2016, and look what happens. Trump won in 2016 in a squeaker against Hillary Clinton, but in this circumstance, he absolutely crushes her. Don't worry about Maine, as we'll talk about Maine in Chapter 8. Maine is weird too. But aside from Maine and Nebraska, there's only like 10 states or so where men vote more Democratic than they do Republican. For the rest of the country, they tend to vote overwhelmingly Republican. So these are the different ways. These are the different ways that Democrats and Republicans sift out democratically. Or demographically is what I meant to say. By the way, what you're looking at right here, this right here is what we call the gender gap. The gender gap is the difference in how men and women vote. Women tend to vote more Democratic. Men tend to vote more Republican. All right, so that's the second part of Chapter 6. Let's wrap up with the third and final part. Let's talk about the media. Now, the media in America has a nickname because of its important role in our society. It's often called the fourth branch of government or the fourth estate. It carries that nickname because the media reporting on the government is just as important in a democracy as the government actually doing its job. One more time, the media doing its job in a society and reporting on the government is just as important in a democracy as the government itself, because we get to vote on the government. But let me ask you something. Without the media, how on earth do you know anything the government's doing? I'm not in Jeff City watching the state government do everything. I'm definitely not in Washington, D.C. I'm rarely at the City Hall, even though it's kind of my job. The City Hall here on Chestnut Expressway here in Springfield, I'm almost never in the City Hall watching the City Council do it. I'm following it on Twitter, because again, that is my job. But if I'm not doing that, then to be honest with you, I have no idea what the government is doing unless the media informs us. So the media is absolutely critical to a democratic society, and in my opinion, It deserves its own chapter. It shouldn't be looped in with chapter 6. It shouldn't be, but it is anyways. Let's talk about the different roles that the media has in our society. These are in the chapter. Let's run through them real quick. Obviously, their job is to entertain us in various ways and to inform us. So their entertainment is a big responsibility, and so is reporting and informing us. In addition to that, it serves democratic functions. It helps us identify public problems. Like, I wouldn't know anything about lead in water pipes in Michigan. I wouldn't know anything about that. I'm not from Michigan. I don't know anybody in Michigan. But the media tells me that there is a gigantic problem. Well, at least it doesn't tell me. It informs me. I'm not just be like, you got it, media, because I get to exercise independent thinking. But it tells the stories of people who have suffered from lead poisoning in Michigan from lead pipes. And as a result, I now know about that thanks to the media. On top of that, it also socializes us. It helps us understand what's going on in our culture. It helps us adapt to each other, identify trends. You ever notice how people who don't follow the media at all, like shut-ins that don't track the media in any way, tend to be a little bit different than anybody else? It's because they're not being socialized the same way everybody else is. That's not to say that they're bad necessarily. It also provides us a public forum, a means by which we can hold elected officials accountable. Last but not least, and very critically, something we'll talk about here before long, the job of the media is to make money. That is a complication. It is not a nonprofit. They need to make money to survive. So as a result, that has an impact on the nature of their reporting. We'll talk about that here in just a few. Guys, if you had to guess, what is the most prominent medium people use today to get their news? And I'm willing to guess, because you're taking this class on the internet and you're watching me on the internet, you would guess digital platforms. That's correct. 86% of Americans say that they get their news from digital platforms. That you need to know. What you don't need to know is this right here, that the other things come in, a distant second, third, and fourth. But you do need to know digital platforms. Digital platforms, for sure. That's the number one way people get their news. Now, one of the reasons why the media is grouped into Chapter 6 is because Chapter 6 also talks about political socialization. And the media plays a role in our political socialization. We don't get our political views just from the people that we see face to face. We get a lot of our political views from the media we consume. And that's benign. I mean, you have to absorb media to get information. That's not necessarily a sinister thing, but it can have an impact on your politics. Like, for instance, oftentimes in the media outlet that you choose has to decide what they're going to focus on, which means they're not going to report on every story under the sun. Now, that may sound sinister to some of us, where we're like, wait a minute, I don't want the media that only picks and chooses stories. I want the media that gives me everything that's going on. Well, no, that's not possible. There's a million things happening in America every day. No one outlet can report on all million of those things. They need to decide what stories are worth reporting on and what stories aren't worth reporting on. That's called agenda setting. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, although it can be used in terms of bias by channels such as MSNBC. Well, that's supposed to say MSNBC. I think the there, I think my text was black there, but MSNBC, MSNBC is they are a very liberal, very democratic channel, and as a result, they really only report on stories that make Democrats and liberals look good. They love reporting on stories that make conservatives and Republicans look bad. So agenda setting isn't bad necessarily, although it can be used for more biased purposes. On top of that, your media outlet may engage in priming. Priming is when you only use certain facts to shape the public's response to an issue. In a given story, you don't include all the facts, you only include some facts. Once again, that may sound sinister, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. That's not necessarily sinister. I mean, in some stories, there are a million factoids. You can't report every single factoid in a story sometimes. So as a result, you have to pick and choose what facts to report. And sometimes that may engineer how people feel about certain facts, right? How to feel about certain stories, how to feel about certain issues. Priming. Priming is different from framing. Make sure you know the difference. Framing, this is, I'm not PowerPointing very well today, am I? Everything is like on top of me, right? But anyways, framing is when the media embeds an issue in news story after news story after news story to try to create a drumbeat of issues. And you see this a lot on Fox News. Fox News creates a drumbeat on, right now, I'm recording this in October of 2021. Fox News has already started in. Fox News is a very conservative, very Republican channel. I would avoid MSNBC. I would definitely avoid Fox News as well. Both of these are very biased channels. But what Fox News loves to do is report on 100 stories and keep embedding the same issue in it over and over and over again to create like a drumbeat of, that priming you over and over again, framing an issue over and over again. Like right now, it's flooded with like war on Christmas stories. Did you know that there was a war on Christmas going on? I certainly didn't. But anytime something happens that may jeopardize the complete celebration of Christmas somewhere in America, Fox News is going to report on it, and they're going to use the phrase war on Christmas over and over and over again. What are they doing? Well, they're trying to embed this issue of war on Christmas and defending Christmas over and over again to really gin up their audience on the issue. I would really avoid both of these jokers. Okay, I would avoid Fox News very aggressively. I would avoid MSNBC as well. We'll talk about bias here in just a minute. I think we've already kind of flirted with bias a little bit with these two, but nonetheless, we'll talk about bias here in just a minute. But first of all, let's cut back to something I was talking about a moment ago. The media is supposed to entertain, it's supposed to inform, but primarily it needs to make money. It needs to make money to survive. And if there's nothing else you get from this chapter, make sure you get this. The media in America is privately owned. The media in America is privately owned. It's privately owned. Now, what that means is it's not owned by the government. The government does not own the media. Individuals and companies own the media, okay? And since individuals and companies own the media, that means, oh, I did say that, didn't I? I did just say that. The government, once again, the media in the country is privately owned. That means the government doesn't own it. It does regulate it. Like, for instance, you can't put rated R, rated X stuff on Nickelodeon. Anyways, because the media is privately owned, that means it needs to make money. But we'll talk about the impact of that here in a few. First, there are some downsides with having a media that is privately owned, but it almost doesn't matter. It almost doesn't matter because it's all counterbalanced by this overwhelmingly positive thing. Because the media is privately owned, it means the government doesn't control it. It has political freedom. It has political freedom. The media in this country has political freedom, meaning it can report on whatever it wants to report whenever it wants to report it. That's critical because sometimes the government doesn't want you to know things, but thanks to the media, we can still find them out usually. Okay? If we might not have known about the disaster of the Afghanistan pullout during the Biden administration, which we're currently living through, if it wasn't for the media reporting on it. We might not have known about children being separated from their families at the border under the Trump administration if it wasn't for the media reporting on it. The government tries to clamp down and keep things secret, but the media is at it, trying to report it. Okay? Now, with that in mind, Because the media is privately owned, that means it needs profit to survive. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with having profit or needing profit, but that does create complications that does affect the quality of reporting sometimes. For instance, because the media needs profit, what's the number way the media earns money in 2021? The number one way they don't, let me try that again. The number one way they earn money? Advertising. It's not very good structuring there, but advertising is the number one way they earn money. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with advertising, but it does create some problems. The goal of advertising, pretty simple. Get as many people to watch your channel, listen to your radio station, listen to your podcast, read your website, get as many consumers as possible so you can charge more for advertising. That does mean you got to get people to watch or read or listen. That does mean that boring issues that aren't going to absorb a ton of attention will get ignored. Right now, the Biden administration is working on the Build Back Better plan. We know a whole lot about how much it costs. We know a whole lot about how much Democrats are fighting about each other. That is, if you're reading about it in the news. But you know, if you don't really know a ton of stuff that's in this massive $2 trillion bill right now. You don't know a lot that's going into it. Did you know that universal child care is going into it potentially? Universal pre-kindergarten. Did you know that they're going to continue child tax credits for another year or two? The enhanced child tax credits. Did you know that there are some climate provisions going into it? Do you know what those climate provisions are? You don't, and that's because it's a boring story. It's a very important story, but it is boring. Now, on top of that, stories that are less important but will get a whole bunch of eyeballs or a whole bunch of ears will get over-reported, such as sensationalism. Stories that might not be so important in your life, like God forbid the Kardashians sneeze on camera. Everybody reports about it, right? It's not super important, but because people watch it, news stations will over-report that stuff, and that's because it brings in a lot of eyeballs, it brings in a lot of ears, and will lead to you being able to charge more for advertising. Now, on top of that, sometimes there are conflicts of interest because companies, these industries, these companies are usually the ones owning media outlets. If that company is up to shenanigans, then the media outlet it owns might not report on it. Okay, for instance, Amazon owns the Washington Post. And the Washington Post, as a result, there's a conflict of interest there anytime it reports on Amazon. There's not a ton of incentive for them to report on wrongdoings by Amazon because that's their parent company, the people who sign their checks, right? Another problem with depending on profit and advertising is bias. If news outlets feel like their audience wants bias, they will deliver it. They will deliver it. They're not stupid. Fox News, MSNBC, they're not stupid. They know their audience. Their audience wants biased news that tells them what they already believe, and so these channels are willing to give that. Matter of fact, let's take some time to talk about bias. Okay? Because the media does carry with it a bias. But keep in mind, the media isn't an entity. There's not like a media. The media is thousands of organizations. Okay? It's thousands of different organizations, and it's decentralized. And yes, they all carry with themselves a bias for something. Sometimes that bias is political. You certainly see that with Fox News and MSNBC. They are favoring one party over the other in their reporting. But despite the fact that all these different outlets have biases on all these different things, the overwhelming bias of all media is, as we said a moment, sensationalism. Here's an example of that.
Could the biggest science project ever lead to the end of the world?
An enormous earthquake or a massive volcano eruption or asteroids smashing into the earth? Will that happen?
A massive gas line ruptures. Could it happen in your neighborhood?
How many sex offenders live in your neighborhood?
Are there terrorist cells in your neighborhood?
Marijuana. Could it be in your neighborhood?
So-called dirty bombs spewing toxic gas and radiation.
Is America ready?
Is the U.S. next?
Is America dangerously underprepared?
The flip-flop is the new sneaker, but behind the sandal lurks serious danger.
If you think you're immune, you better think again.
Obama's plan is going to kill you.
Not only lack of sleep that could kill you, it's sleeping too much.
What about the water that comes out of your faucet? Did you know that there could be stuff in there that could harm or even kill your kids?
Are your kids being brainwashed? I'll tell you who's taking cues from the Nazis.
A town in California is insisting that every second grader learns about gay penguins.
Social engineering of America's children.
We'll have global governance run by elites.
We'll have our own little China workforce right here in America.
Doomsday 2000. Killer bees. Bird flu.
The terror threat. The superbug.
Global pandemic, illegal aliens,
Gun restrictions,
Right-wing terrorism.
evangelical Christianity,
gay marriage, death panels,
The flip-flop
indoctrination, militias,
Anarchy, chaos, and cannibalism.
Gosh, we better wake up soon. We're gonna wake up dead.
I am interrupting this video for a moment for a couple different reasons. First of all, I don't want to have to re-record this video later. So YouTube, please don't consider this a copyright violation. Okay? It's not a copyright violation if I'm interrupting it, I think. But second of all, so far we've seen a whole bunch of sensationalism that you should be scared. But the second half of this video that I'm about to press play on really focuses on the fact that you should be scared of people with different politics and beliefs than you.
Progressivism is a cancer.
The Republican Party has gone completely brain dead.
The far left does not want the USA to defeat terrorism.
The Republicans want you to die quickly if you get sick.
The left believes Americans are stupid.
Republicans lie.
You cannot be a liberal and a Christian.
We have a village idiot in this country. It's called fundamentalist Christianity.
Islam is a lie from the pit of hell.
Atheists are parasites.
There is a gay and secular fascism in this country.
The Tea Partiers are misguided. I think they're racist.
Racism in this country is the exclusive province of the left.
Rush Limbaugh, overt racist.
Everybody knows liberals hate guns.
I think they are clinging to their guns and their religion.
Our government is all evil right now.
Barack Obama is the worst president in history.
Do you think the president's anti-Semitic?
I do.
This guy is, I believe, a racist.
In Scott Brown, we have an irresponsible, homophobic, racist, reactionary, ex-new model.
Hollywood liberal is a Learjet limousine liberal that wants to tax everybody, be generous with everybody else's money. You know what our real problem is?
A country full of Joe the Plumbers,
Crazed teabaggers,
Criminal illegal aliens, far-right cranks, far-left loons,
Right-wing nut jobs,
practicing homosexuals,
Mainstream media, radical imams.
un-American bastards.
the Harvard elites,
Gun nuts,
tree huggers, yahoos, and birthers.
Fabian socialists.
crazies, let's say. They are what's wrong with America.
So even though you are seeing a video from all different perspectives claiming that the people who aren't them are evil people jumping the fence coming to get you in the dark of the night, it all sounds the same. There are people who are not you and they are coming to get you. So that is some crazy sensationalism. With that in mind, let me soothe your savage nerves for a moment. That seems pretty bleak. This was on the news. All of the stuff that you saw was on the news, okay? It's just TV, folks. Just TV. It's just TV, okay? It's just TV. It's nothing compared to the internet because as we know, the internet is a place where rationality runs free. Rationality, everybody is concerned and very focused and very calm on the internet. Rarely are people posting extreme opinions with zero backing on the, of course I'm just kidding, right? Because the internet bias is even worse than the TV bias. Because there are thousands and thousands of outlets on the internet, if you're liberal, you can wake up in the morning, brush your teeth, go to school or work, go home, eat your dinner, go to bed. You could live your entire day just scrolling left-wing media. Left-wing media telling you about how the Republicans are ruining House maps, about how they'd like to end democracy, about people are trying to take food out of children's mouths, millionaire yacht owners, how corporate America is attacking all of us, attacking our unions. Now, these stories may very well have facts embedded, but the point of the left-wing media isn't necessarily to lie to you or make up facts. They don't do that so much anymore. That used to be a really big problem. Nowadays, It's not so much that they're making stuff up, it's that they're really only reporting from the left. They're not giving you the whole breadth of the news. They're only giving you pro-liberal, pro-Democratic Party, anti-conservative, anti-Republican news. Same thing with the right-wing media. You could spend your entire day doing nothing but scrolling right-wing media, and you will never have to do a single thing. You will never have to read a single thing that disagrees with your conservative beliefs. You could just read conservative media all day. You could read about how Biden is failing the border, about how the media freaks out because they have Trump derangement, about how Biden is flying, immigrants all over America, about how the vaccine mandate is running into some political headwinds. Again, just like the liberal stuff, it's not that they're just making up stories whole cloth, like some of those magazines you see, some of those magazines you see in the supermarket, which just completely make stuff up. It's not that they're making stuff up necessarily. It's that they're exclusively reporting from the right. They're exclusively reporting pro-conservative, pro-Republican news, and ignoring any news that runs counter to that narrative. Now, let me give you a slide that you don't necessarily need to know. This is not something I'm going to examine you over. This slide right here, I'm not asking you to know anything on this slide for a future exam, but in case you're wondering, geez, there's so much bias out there, how can I get the best accurate news? Well, there really is no one way of doing that, but there are several things you can do, several precautions you can take to make sure you're getting the most accurate news possible. First of all, you can make sure you get your news from several sources. If you see something that's too crazy to be believed, but only one outlet's reporting it, maybe hold off on running with it and sharing it on social media. On top of that, you should prefer news that offers primary sources, that offers evidence, offers clips, offers video, offers quotes, offers research, offers data, and not just this guy said at one point. This politician suggested once that this would happen. I want you to follow primary sources, not just hearsay. On top of that, avoid obviously sketchy sources of information. Watch out for stuff people share on social media. Memes are notoriously unreliable. 80% of the memes I see on social media omit key facts. Memes are not a great place to get your information. They just don't include any detail or any explanation whatsoever. Politicians or political parties, they have skin in the game. They benefit from you being misinformed, so don't believe them either. You can verify what they're saying, but because sometimes what they're saying is true, but don't take their word for it. Don't take their word for it. If you are more conservative or if you are more liberal, maybe consider a source of news that disagrees with you. Consider a conservative source. Consider a more liberal source if you're more conservative, okay? So that's how you end up with the best battle-tested ideas. At the end of the day, if you got friends that are politically inclined, talk to them, because it's really, really easy to take political views and be really extreme about it when you're talking on the internet and you don't see people face to face. But when you talk to people face to face and you happen to disagree with them, which I think is always better, you find yourself being more reasonable, right? You try to say, well, I understand your point of view. Here's where I'm trying to come from. And it starts to demystify and it stops, demonizing people with opposite points of view. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in Chapter 6, this slide you don't need to know. This slide you absolutely do, because this is a hot issue. Hot issue here in America right now, and it's something called net neutrality. It deals with the media. It's a complicated subject. Let's simplify it, please, okay? So, let's start with the basics with net neutrality. Generally speaking, every website on the internet loads at roughly the same speed. And that's not because every website is run the same. They're not. I might have a different website than you. You might have a fantastic server that runs stuff fast. I might have crapped out on a cheap server, and as a result, my website might run somewhat slower. But the internet service providers, the people who provide our internet, they can't decide if my website runs fast or slow. Only my choices can cause that. Which is the point I'm trying to make here. The people who run the websites get to make their own decisions about how fast their website loads. Internet service providers can't treat us differently. They can't slow me down and speed you up. If I'm going up against Amazon.com, which obviously runs very, very fast, they have the greatest everything because they have a gajillion dollars. But like if I'm selling Crocs socks or if I'm selling Crocs, that makes sense because that's my name, right? Crockerscrocs.com or whatever. So if I'm selling Crocs on my own personal website, it will run roughly at the same speed of Amazon unless I made a bunch of disastrous decisions to make my website run slow. This is called net neutrality. It ensures that every website runs at roughly the same speeds. Now, people don't understand net neutrality, but whenever you explain this to people, it pulls pretty close to consensus, one of the first things we talked about in this chapter. People overwhelmingly like net neutrality when it's explained to them. With that in mind, though, there are some entities that don't like net neutrality, and it's the huge cable companies that serve as our internet service providers. Your internet service provider is probably a huge cable company. If you're here in Springfield, it's AT&T or Mediacom. Okay? Maybe it's Comcast in other parts of the country. But regardless, they are not huge fans of net neutrality. What they would like to do is get rid of net neutrality because that will allow them to charge people for what they'll call optimal speeds. We're going to give all of you an average speed, but if you would like an optimal speed, pay us a fee. Now the problem with that necessarily is that depending on the fee, not everybody might be able to pay it. Obviously, the biggest and the baddest websites like Amazon.com can pay any fee because they are the wealthiest corporation on the planet. But Crocs socks or Crocs or whatever it is I'm selling, they might not be able to pay the fee. And this will create a two-tiered system where you have really large companies running with optimal web speeds and you will have other smaller websites run by small businesses, which is a big deal these days. Commerce is going increasingly virtual. And as a result, this will create a two-tiered system that's going to hurt small businesses even more. Now, the Biden administration has reinstituted net neutrality. At least they're in the process of reinstituting it. Because the prior two presidencies, Obama and Trump, both tried to get rid of it. Trump was successful at doing it. The Obama administration tried to get rid of it and couldn't, and followed up with the Trump administration who wanted to get rid of it and did. But the Biden administration is bringing it back. So we're on the front lines of net neutrality right now. But let's go back to that, because I just shared an incredible fact with you, didn't I? That Obama and Trump tried to get rid of net neutrality. I don't know if you can find two more different people on the planet than Obama and Trump. They disagree on everything politically, but the one thing they agree on is that they had to get rid of net neutrality. Why? Why is this the one thing these guys agree on? John Oliver explains.
And you might wonder, well, look, if everyone is against this, how is it even possibly happening? Well, consider who would benefit from this change. Cable companies. Verizon wants a two-tier system so badly, they sued the government to force the rule change that's currently being discussed. These companies have Washington in their pockets to a conveniently almost unbelievable degree.
Comcast has spent $18,810,000 in lobbying last year. That's more than any other company except for defense contractor Northrop Grumman.
So just to be clear, the ranking of who buys government influence is number 1, military-industrial complex, and number 2, the provider of lizard-lick towing. Look, I could show you the troublingly cozy relationship between cable companies and Washington in any number of ways. I could show you the president golfing with the CEO of Comcast, or saying at a fundraiser at a cable executive's house that he'd been there so many times, the only thing I haven't done in this house is have Seder dinner. But perhaps the most succinct way is this.
The president has picked Tom Wheeler, a former top lobbyist for cable and wireless companies, to be the next chair of the Federal Communications Commission.
Yes. The guy who used to run the cable industry's lobbying arm is now running the agency tasked with regulating it. That is the equivalent of needing a babysitter and hiring a dingo. Thanks for stopping over. make sure they're in bed by 8. There's 20 bucks on the table for kibble. So, please don't eat my baby. With the fact that they are practically overseeing their own oversight, it is hardly surprising that cable companies are basically monopolies now. A federal study found that 96% of the population had access to 2 or fewer cable broadband providers. It's almost as if they've agreed to stay out of each other's way like drug cartels. But hold on, no, that's not fair. That's not fair. I mean, if hypothetically a cable company like Comcast were planning to merge with a company like, let's say, Time Warner, it's not like their CEO would sit down and mark out who had which turf, right?
Both in video and in broadband, we don't compete with Time Warner. You have to start with that very fundamental point. They're in New York, we're in Philadelphia, they're in LA, we're in San Francisco. You can't buy a Comcast in New York, you can't buy a Time Warner in Philadelphia. So there's no reduction in competition.
Exactly. You can't reduce competition when nobody is competing. You could not be describing a monopoly more clearly if you were wearing a metal top hat while driving a metal car after winning second prize in a beauty contest.
All right, so clearly what we're picking up from the John Oliver presentation there is that the reason why Obama and Trump and Democrats and Republicans seem to only agree on getting rid of net neutrality, something that the general public really wants, it's because both of them face immense pressure from interest groups. Now, you don't need to know interest groups in this exact moment. It is actually the topic of the very next chapter. So best of luck in your preparation for Chapter 6. Chapter 7, we'll get into interest groups, we'll talk about political parties, and continue this conversation of government influence. Thank you so much.